We once believed ourselves the apex of intelligent design, until we discovered Earth. In the outer reaches of the Persian Fringe, our deep space reconnaissance drones picked up anomalous electromagnetic signatures, pulses of radiation not quite random, not entirely natural. For cycles, we dismissed them as planetary noise, static from a dying world, but the pattern held. The noise, we learned, was information, fragmented, chaotic, but unmistakably artificial. That discovery ignited what our historians will one day call the Great Curiosity, a coalition of xenoscholars, linguists first, contact envoys, and cultural historians united for one purpose: to uncover the truth of the blue planet in Sector Sol 3. What we found was unsettling. Humans carbon-based bipeds with limited lifespans, soft exteriors, and seemingly inefficient energy systems were not the grand discovery we anticipated at first. They had no hive mind, no quantum neural web, no collective conscience. They were fragmented, divisive, and discordant even among their own kind. They had drawn lines across their planet, separated themselves by skin hue, language structure, ancient tribal affiliations, and imaginary constructs they called nations. They seemed incapable of unity, primitive, but first impressions, as we have learned, can be dangerously misleading. We sent observation drones cloaked in gravimetric shrouds. We watched them in their natural environments, cities pulsing with noise and light, forests echoing with gunfire, schools teaching children history soaked in blood. They were not what we expected, and in that realization, our awe turned to fear. These creatures had split the atom before they achieved planetary unity. They had constructed weapons capable of extinction before they fully mapped their oceans. They had reached space not through the patient evolution of science, but through a frenzy of competition, a race driven not by peace, but by rivalry, by fear, by dominance. Two great tribes vying not just for control of land, but for the soul of their species. And even when they touched the void, it was not with reverence, but with flags. We had never seen such a thing. To understand them, we studied their transmissions, thousands of cycles worth of data. Digital records, broadcast signals, cultural imprints encoded in what they call media. What we encountered was a species obsessed with struggle, not merely the act of combat, but the idea of it, the narrative of resistance, the myth of the righteous warrior, the romanticism of sacrifice. From their earliest legends to their modern recreations, violence was not a shameful past, but a celebrated constant. We saw children idolize killers. We saw games played for pleasure that simulated death. We saw 1,000 iterations of apocalypse imagined, sung, filmed, and cherished, not with dread but fascination. They do not fear war, they expect it, they prepare for it. It is, to them, inevitable. And even more chilling, they do not always fight for survival. Often, they fight for ideals, for abstracts, for things they cannot see or touch: honor, glory, vengeance, belief. Concepts that cannot be measured, cannot be quantified, and thus cannot be reasoned with. We have encountered violent species before, but never one that justified violence as virtue. When we examined their biology, their planet's brutal history, and their psychological patterns, a darker truth emerged. They had not simply survived war, they had been shaped by it. War was not a deviation in their evolution. It was the catalyst. This was no primitive species clawing toward peace. This was a predator that had taught itself to dream. And for the first time in generations, the council debated, not about policy or trade, but about danger, not to them, but to us. We thought we had found another people to welcome into the fold of galactic society. Instead, we found a mirror, cracked, blood-stained, and grinning. Their DNA tells a story older than their stars, one of endless war, struggle, and adaptation to violence. At first, we thought humans were simply aggressive, a common trait in younger civilizations. Many species in their infancy resort to conflict when resources are scarce or territory is disputed. It is, in a primitive sense, a survival mechanism, but with humans, aggression is not a temporary phase. It is an evolutionary constant. We began with the genome, after obtaining a viable sample, unwillingly donated by a military casualty during one of their countless civil skirmishes. We ran it through our comparative analysis matrix. What we found was not just unique, it was singular. Their genetic code is riddled with signatures of adaptation under extreme pressure, temperature, disease, trauma, famine, and most notably, violence. Repeated patterns of selective pressures that favored endurance, aggression, reaction speed, and emotional compartmentalization. This was not a species that merely survived hardship. This was a species refined by it. Their ancestors were apex predators on a world of monsters. Their bodies are built for pursuit, forward, facing eyes for targeting, upright stance for long, distance tracking, a cardiovascular system optimized for high adrenaline bursts of exertion. But it goes deeper. Their skin scars rather than regenerates, a primitive but effective form of battlefield memory, marking those who survive violence and warning others through visible experience. Their bones break and regrow. Their muscles tear and rebuild stronger. Their brains, though unstable by our standards, are capable of adapting to trauma in ways we believed impossible. We studied their stress response and found it disturbingly effective. In most species, extended exposure to danger leads to cognitive decay or emotional collapse. In humans, repeated exposure creates what they call tolerance. They learn to live with horror. Some even learn to thrive in it. The damage molds them rather than breaking them. They have evolved not to flee from war, but to persist in it. Perhaps most disconcerting is the presence of mirror neurons, which allow them to feel the pain of others, a trait associated with social empathy. We believed this would be the redeeming trait of their biology, the counterbalance to their violent past, but even this has been repurposed. That same neurological architecture allows them to manipulate, deceive, and wage psychological warfare with terrifying precision. They can imagine the pain of others and still choose to inflict it. Their immune systems are aggressive almost to the point of self-destruction. They fight infection with the same ferocity they fight each other, ruthless and indiscriminate. In fact, many of their own internal systems are at war with themselves. They suffer from disorders where their bodies attack their own tissues, unable to distinguish friend from foe. It is a tragic flaw, yes, but also an echo of a deeper truth. Even at the cellular level, the human organism is prepared for endless conflict. We traced their ancestry, mapped their migration patterns, and found more evidence. In every corner of their planet, no matter the climate or landscape, they fought. Tribes, clans, empires, coalitions. They formed, rose, and fell through conquest. They invented weapons before written language. They learned to kill in groups before they learned to build homes. Their social structures evolved alongside strategies for attack and defense. Even their cooperative instincts, something we at first mistook for a peaceful inclination, were honed through warfare. Brotherhood, loyalty, sacrifice, these traits emerge most strongly in battle, and as we looked deeper, a chilling realization took root. Evolution did not merely allow war in humans, it demanded it. It selected for those who could kill, endure loss, and press forward. Those who hesitated were removed from the gene pool. Mercy was a liability. Doubt was death. What emerged after millions of years was not just a sentient species, it was a biological war machine, self-replicating, self-justifying, endlessly creative in its methods of destruction. A species not built in spite of violence, but because of it. This was no accident. Humanity was not forged in peace, then lost to violence. They were born in blood, and they have never truly left it. 2/2, even their myths, music, and stories bleed. When we turned our attention from human biology to their culture, we expected to find the taming influence of civilization. History has shown us that many species evolve brutal tools of survival, only to shed them as society matures, developing art, philosophy, and harmony as substitutes for the primal instinct to dominate. But in humans, culture does not erase violence. It refines it, it ritualizes it, it immortalizes it. We began with language. The very structure of their idioms is soaked in conflict. Everyday phrases are laced with martial undertones, battling illness, fighting for rights, taking a shot. Collateral damage, hostile takeover. They speak of love as conquest, of success as domination, of struggle as virtue. Their words betray a world, where conflict is not only expected, it is woven into the very way they interpret existence. Then we examined their stories, from the earliest preserved oral traditions to modern cinematic epics. The same themes echoed: war, revenge, sacrifice, conquest, resistance, victory at unimaginable cost. In every culture, on every continent, their heroes are warriors. Their legends are forged on battlefields, not in temples. Prometheus defies the gods and is punished for rebellion. Gilgamesh slays monsters to gain glory. Beowulf dies in the act of defeating an enemy too great to survive. In their myths, peace is never permanent. It is only the silence between wars. As we expanded our study to their literature, cinema, and digital media, the trend intensified. Their greatest artistic triumphs are born from blood. Shakespeare, considered a pinnacle of their early literature, filled his most celebrated works with murder, betrayal, duels, and wars of succession. Their modern films, broadcast to billions, glorify war on unimaginable scales. Even their stories set in distant futures or fantasy realms recreate battles endlessly, as though war is not just history, but destiny. Even more revealing was the emotional tone. Their tragedies are not about the loss of peace, but the loss of comrades in battle. Their comedies often rely on violence turned absurd. Their most cherished stories are about victory through suffering. They love stories of the underdog, not because the underdog finds peace, but because the underdog fights back. The resolution is not reconciliation, but revenge, and they do not limit violence to fiction. Their celebrations of history, their holidays, monuments, and national rituals memorialize war, victory days, independence won through bloodshed, remembrance of fallen soldiers, statues of generals, flags raised over battlefields. Every generation is taught the same narrative. You are free because others fought. Someday you may have to fight too. Even their music, a supposedly universal language of emotion, is filled with the cadence of war. Drums that mimic the march of troops, anthems sung with clenched fists, lyrics that glorify resistance, vengeance, or conquest. Even in genres meant for celebration or love, themes of power, control, and dominance find their way in. Battle cries set to melody, war chants hidden in pop songs. We observed how conflict shapes their identity at every level. It is in their art, their religions, their philosophies. Many of their belief systems center around apocalyptic battles between good and evil. Gods do not create and nurture. They fight, they punish, they destroy. Peace in their moral frameworks is not the default state of the universe. It is the reward for winning the war, and this cultural conditioning is not passive. It is self-reinforcing. They teach children through stories of conflict. They play games based on strategy and domination. They model victory not as harmony, but as the defeat of an opponent. Their art does not imagine a world without war. It imagines how to win in one. We had hoped their culture might counterbalance their biology, that art might have softened the blade. Instead, we found the opposite. Their culture is the scabbard that sharpens it. They invented fire, then bombs, then annihilation, before they left the Stone Age. Technology, in most species, emerges slowly. Tools are developed to meet essential needs: farming, shelter, healing, exploration. Violence is a byproduct, a side effect, often suppressed as understanding deepens. But with humans, war was not just a consequence of innovation, it was the impetus. Their technological progress is not a line of peaceful development interrupted by violence. It is a chain of weapons sharpened by each generation. Their earliest tools were not for agriculture or construction, but for killing. Sharpened stones to pierce flesh, clubs to break bone, spears to hunt prey, but also to strike rivals. They did not wait to discover metallurgy before building armies. They organized tribal warbands before they had writing. The first cities emerged not just to protect grain stores, but to raise walls against invaders. From the beginning, they understood if they wanted to survive, they had to outfight their enemies. As they grew in number, so did the complexity of their weapons. The bow was not enough. They invented the catapult, the ballista, and the battering ram. They melted rock into bronze and then into iron, not just to create tools for harvest, but swords and armor. Their civilizations rose and fell on the strength of their forges. Even when they discovered mathematics, it was swiftly used to perfect the trajectory of projectiles. Geometry helped them build fortresses and siege engines. Chemistry gave birth to gunpowder. Explosions were no longer accidental. They were engineered. Gunpowder changed everything. A single individual could now kill many. Distance no longer meant safety, but humanity did not stop. Where others would have paused, they accelerated. They built ships, not to cross oceans in peace, but to deliver war across the seas. They designed fleets, formations, and doctrines, and when the sea was not enough, they turned to the sky. Flight, one of their greatest achievements, was barely in its infancy before it was weaponized. The first planes were used to drop bombs. A dream of soaring through the heavens became a nightmare of fire raining from above. Their machines grew larger, their weapons deadlier. They developed automatic firearms, artillery, tanks, and submarines. Each conflict drove them to invent something new, something more efficient at killing. It became a cycle. War begat invention. Invention begat more war. Then came the split atom. We studied the timeline closely. They were barely capable of consistent long-range communication. They had not even reached all corners of their own planet, yet they figured out how to unbind the fundamental forces of matter. In their pursuit of power, they unlocked the means to destroy themselves completely. And rather than recoil in horror, they built more. They constructed arsenals, doomsday devices, warheads so powerful they could erase cities in seconds. Deterrence, they called it, as if the threat of extinction was a form of diplomacy, as if promising mutual annihilation was a substitute for trust. And still they pressed forward. Satellites, missiles, drones, cybernetic systems. Their current conflicts are not even bound to physical space. They wage war with code now. Viruses and worms infecting digital networks, sabotaging, spying, disabling. Even in peace, Their machines are primed for violence. What makes this progression so alarming is not just its scale or speed, but its consistency. At every major milestone in human technological development, a corresponding military application followed, sometimes immediately, sometimes even first. They do not wait for threats, they anticipate them. They prepare. Many species innovate through need, but humans innovate through fear, through suspicion, through the expectation of hostility. They assume war is always coming, and in doing so, they create the very tools that guarantee it will. We hope to find in their machines a trace of nobility, a search for knowledge, for beauty, for transcendence. But we found circuits tuned for targeting, engines built to carry payloads, and equations refined to maximize destruction. Their greatest minds did not dream of paradise. They engineered the mechanics of death. Their greatest wars were not fought with guns, but with ideas. When we studied the human record of conflict, we expected to find a history of physical struggle, armies clashing, empires rising and falling, revolutions etched in blood, and we did, but layered beneath those visible battles was something more complex, more insidious. A war of minds, a war of stories, a war of perception. Humanity, more than any other species we've encountered, has mastered psychological warfare, not just as a military tactic, but as a way of life. They understand, almost instinctively, that fear can be more powerful than force, that an idea planted in the mind of an enemy or a citizen can achieve more than any weapon. Propaganda was one of their earliest tools of organized conflict. Ancient leaders carved lies in stone, built monuments not to truth but to power. They told their people that they were chosen, that their enemies were monsters, that the gods stood behind them. And so millions marched to war believing they were doing what was right, what was holy. This was not limited to the ancient world. In every era, human powers refined their ability to control thought. Their leaders learned to shape public opinion with symbols, slogans, and rituals. Words were chosen carefully to dehumanize opponents, vermin, infidels, terrorists. With language alone, entire populations could be conditioned to accept atrocity as necessity. Even more chilling was their ability to direct this power inward. Humans deceive themselves as readily as they deceive others. They construct narratives to justify horrors. A war of conquest becomes a war of liberation. A genocide becomes a purging. They rewrite history not only in books, but in memory. Whole generations grow up believing falsehoods because it is more comfortable than facing the truth. We discovered records of governments erasing evidence of massacres, of entire events being reshaped through media until the perpetrators were remembered as heroes. Their control of narrative does not require force. It requires repetition. Humans are uniquely susceptible to familiarity bias. The more they hear something, the more they believe it. Those in power exploit this with terrifying precision. They flood the senses with selective truths, distortions, and distractions. They know that confusion can be more useful than clarity. A divided people cannot resist, and this manipulation is not merely political. It permeates every level of society. Corporations wield psychological tactics to influence behavior, encouraging consumption, loyalty, conformity. Religious institutions frame belief as identity, insulating followers from dissenting views. Social groups construct internal codes, rewarding obedience, punishing deviation, not with violence, but with shame, exclusion, fear. It is no surprise, then, that when humans do fight, they do not stop at the battlefield. They wage information warfare. They hack, leak, subvert. They weaponize secrets. Disinformation campaigns destabilize entire regions. Memes, simple images paired with text, can sway millions. A viral idea spreads faster than any bullet and leaves no physical trace. We observed entire elections swayed not by policy, but by illusion. We watched people act against their own interests, not because they were forced to, but because they were made to believe it was noble, necessary, patriotic. Their greatest generals are not always soldiers. Often they are orators, writers, media strategists, those who understand that the pen in human hands is just another blade. What makes their psychological warfare so dangerous is how personalized it is. They know how to target individuals, not just groups. Algorithms track behavior, preferences, fears. Advertisements become tailored indoctrination. Lies are sculpted to feel true. Even resistance is predicted, shaped, and sometimes manufactured to serve larger agendas. In humans, the battlefield is everywhere, in the classroom, on the screen, in the home, in the mirror. They do not need to conquer bodies when they can conquer minds. And in doing so, they turn their enemies into their weapons, their victims into their advocates, their captives into their believers. It is a war of ghosts, unseen, unheard, but no less devastating. They do not fear death, they plan for it. At first, this statement seemed contradictory. All living beings cling to survival, and humans are no exception. Their bodies resist death on every level, biologically, emotionally, instinctively, yet paradoxically, they do not treat death as the ultimate end. They do not avoid it as an unthinkable failure. They embrace it. They expect it. In many cases, they choose it, if it means achieving a purpose greater than themselves. We observed a disturbing pattern across cultures, across history, and across individual behavior. Humans consistently valorize sacrifice. From their earliest myths to modern state doctrines, death is not seen as a tragedy to avoid, but as a transaction. A cost paid willingly for victory, for principle, for tribe, for belief. Their soldiers march knowing they may die, not just in defense, but in offense. Many do so proudly. No other species in the galactic record has so thoroughly ritualized their own destruction. Their literature speaks of dying well, of a good death. Their most revered heroes often perish in the final act, cut down not in defeat, but in defiance. Their religions offer rewards for death in service of faith. Martyrdom is not feared, it is sanctified. Generations are taught that the greatest act is not to live long, but to die for the right reason. Even those who claim to live in secular systems repeat the same ideals. He died for his country, she gave her life for freedom. They speak these phrases not with horror, but with reverence. Their media glorifies last stands, doomed charges, self-destruction in the name of a cause. They cheer for characters who strap explosives to themselves, if it means defeating the enemy. They mourn such deaths, but more often they celebrate them. This concept of self-sacrifice is not a rare anomaly. It is central to human identity. Entire military doctrines are built around it. Units train for operations with low survival probability. Suicide missions are not considered strategic failures, but necessary evils. In the face of overwhelming odds, humans do not surrender. They hold ground until none are left. Sometimes they destroy their own infrastructure to deny it to the enemy, even knowing it will cost them their lives. They burn their own cities. They flood their own lands. They turn themselves into weapons. More disturbing is the degree to which this mindset is passed on generationally. Children play games of war. They learn of their ancestors' deaths in school not as loss, but as legacy. Monuments are built not only to the victorious, but to the fallen. Cemeteries are treated as sacred ground. Battlefield relics are preserved with pride. Holidays are dedicated to remembering those who died in war, and they are celebrated with parades, not mourning. This deep familiarity with death breeds a kind of terrifying resilience. Where other species would break, they persist. Where others would despair, they galvanize. Loss fuels them. Defeat enrages them. Every fallen human becomes a reason for the next to stand, and when they grieve, they do so not by withdrawing, but by rearming. We expected spacefaring species to dread death as the final cost of conflict, but humans have instead learned to absorb it into their logic. They factor it into every strategy, every plan. Loss is a given. They do not strive to avoid death. They strive to make it meaningful. This belief has made them nearly impossible to deter. They cannot be stopped with threats. Pain does not halt them. Destruction does not end them. The more they are struck down, the more myth they generate around those who fell. We came searching for intelligent life, and found a culture that treats death not as failure, but as fuel. They are not reckless. They are prepared, and the most terrifying truth of all is this: humans may die by the millions, but their will does not die with them, it spreads.